Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Soul Survivor, How I Built a Global Shoe Brand, is the memoir of a British shoe dog, it says here. It's been called a thoroughly entertaining read and a valuable insight into building a business. It's a story of how one man spent 50 years in the trade he loves and built a global brand. Delighted to say that Daniel Rubin, founder of June, joins me live on the line now. Daniel, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Giles. It's great to be here.
Whereabouts do we find you today, and what footwear are you wearing? Are the first two questions.
Well, I'm in my flat, which is right in the centre of London. It's the sun is shining, so it's a nice day. And because I'm in my flat, I'm actually wearing a pair of slippers. So
marvelous.
Nothing very elegant or glamorous, I'm afraid. Just
had they been anything like the rather fantastic shoes that I'm looking at on the front cover, I'd have been a little bit worried for a Wednesday morning, to be honest with you, Daniel.
Yeah, no, that's not my thing, actually. But I love looking at them and helping to design them. But no, they don't really fit my feet very well.
I can imagine, and people downstairs will probably hear you clopping across the floor as well.
That is also true. Yes.
So tell me a little bit about, for those who don't know, a little bit about how you got into the business and what it was that attracted you to the business itself.
Well, I am the fourth generation of my family in shoes. My grandfather left Russia at the end of the 19th century. He was escaping sort of persecution in Russia. And he got on a boat to go and join his brother in New York. And like a lot of immigrants then, he was cheated, told off to get off the boat, and actually was in London, not in New York. And he found it tough. He was sort of worked in a shoe workshop, but eventually, he was successful. He built a factory, opened a factory in 1925. And his sons, he had a big family, he had 7 children. 2 of his sons joined him, started making shoes. So, that was the start of, I guess, my association with shoes. My father actually was a violinist. I mean, he didn't want to be a shoe manufacturer, but, he was persuaded to join the family business. And his advice to me was, Daniel, whatever you do, don't become a shoe manufacturer, become a chartered accountant. And in those days, you listened to your dad, and I became a chartered accountant. But eventually, when I was around 30, I sort of succumbed and joined him making women's fashion shoes in Dalston in London.
Now, when your grandfather set up his business making shoes in 1923, was he making shoes for men, shoes for women? Were they fashion shoes? Were they working shoes? I mean, explain a little bit about that background, because it's like saying, we made clothes. I mean, it's a broad church, isn't it, basically?
It is. In those days, there were a lot of shoe factories in the UK. This was before all the production had moved to the Far East. We were importing shoes from Spain and Italy, but it was mainly made in London and in various towns around the UK. London was a specialist for women's fashion shoes, elegant shoes. They were beautiful shoes. They were made in kid leathers. And there must have been around 40 or 50 small factories making shoes, making these really nice shoes. And they were selling them in the UK. And it was only during, I guess, the 1980s that sort of manufacturing started to move out away from the UK, away from London, mainly to the Far East, where production was just so much cheaper. And where eventually, I'm afraid, the industry just sort of died, and the only manufacturing really left in the UK at the moment is in Northampton, where they make those beautiful men's brogues, but otherwise there's not a lot of shoe manufacturing left in the UK, unfortunately.
I do like it. I do like a good brogue, I must admit. I'm very particular. I had a pair of, you'll probably get a shudder, I had a pair of dark purple brogues in the 80s. I think I probably bought them in Camden Market, but that's another story. But was one of the problems with shoe manufacture as well, because street fashion came in, and because back in the sort of early 70s, the only time you ever saw anybody using trainers when they had to do PE, and suddenly from the States came the trainers and the hip hop, and suddenly, I remember growing up, stomping up and down through London with various types of trainer and Reebok and Adidas and all that, and shoes kind of went out of fashion a bit, I suppose, for both men and women, because everybody wanted to be in streetwear and street trainers.
I don't agree with that, actually.
Okay.
When I came in, the big brand was Bieber. And when I started making shoes with my father in 1975-6, it was all around the Bieber boot. We're making these high leg boots in suede, nice stretchy leathers. And, we used to make them and used to go along to the store in Kensington Church Street.
Oh, yes.
And there was a queue for our boots. And we used to arrive there and say, we've got a size 6. And so, yes, I'll take it. So, I think it was only later that trainers really started to become the major sort of fashion footwear that people were wearing, or comfort footwear. And I think actually it is very much around comfort. But yeah, in the 70s and 80s, there was the platforms, high platforms of the 80s. Do you remember those?
Yep.
There was for men as well, actually. So yeah, I think it was later that when we started to get into performance footwear, the growth of Nike, Adidas, that's when the real revolution came along and people used to be wearing trainers all the time.
You have to trigger something in my old grey matter, because I remember Kensington Market, and I remember what is now the Bluebird was originally the Bluebird Garage, and you could go down there, before Conrad took it over and made it, the wonderful place it is now. But there were loads of independent sort of fashion, creators and shoe designers, and a very good friend of mine who loved her boots up to about here, and I'm pointing to my knees, laced up and with massive platforms. I'd forgotten completely about that down at the Bluebird Garage. So there's always been a history of creative footwear.
Oh, absolutely. There were some really good designers around then that sort of produced some really way out shoes. And it was an exciting time. And actually, it was an exciting time also because people then were shopping in shops. There was no internet.
Correct.
So we didn't have this sort of huge distraction of people going online. You actually had to go to a shop, feel the shoes, put them on your foot. That whole experience. It's still around, obviously, but it's been certainly diluted because now you can buy shoes so many different ways.
Yes, but it's particularly shoes, because if you get a wrong pair, if you get a T-shirt that maybe is a little bit too baggy or too tight, you can kind of live with it a bit. I'll lose a few pounds. If you get a bad pair of shoes, you know about it. You can get through the first hour, but then you take them off and you think, I'm never putting those back on again. So buying them online, you're never going to get that experience, are you? And it's got a serious health benefits to you, disadvantages to you as well.
I think it's around omni-channel. So what happens is you go into the store, you try them on, you quite like them. You go into another store, you quite like them. Eventually you go home and you think, yeah, I did like those June shoes. They were really good. I'm going to buy them. So, you have tried them on in the store. And that's the whole thing now. It's about omni-channel. It's not just shopping through one channel. It's shopping through a whole variety of channels. And what that's done is just made life much more complicated for people like us. Because instead of just having a really nice store in the King's Road where people go in and buy a pair of shoes, now they go online, they look, they go on social, they get different ideas. It's a hugely complicated process and much more difficult than it was when I started out in 1975, yeah. Yeah,
but then again, you see the things. I remember being in the lanes in Brighton, and I was flying back to Spain. It was the day before my birthday, and I saw this really great pair of brogue boots. Yeah, about to mid calf, and they were. I had a budget, and they were about £50 more than my budget, and I walked past them in the lanes about 4 times, and on the 4th time round, each time I went back, well, I can't really afford them, and then I was like, well, it is my birthday, and I don't really like them, and but I knew that because this was a particular shop, they wouldn't be there, and I was flying back. So I kind of convinced, I sold them to myself on the various trips back and forth, which you don't get online.
You don't, and you're absolutely right. You don't get that. And I think, the trouble is people now are much more time short, and they also like one-stop shopping, so I think it's a different world now, but I still think that exists. I still think that love of shoes, that sort of, because they're an amazing product, they are architectural, they are, they're different. Just think about the wear and tear that you have on a pair of shoes compared to a T-shirt. They are tough. There are 150 processes in making a pair of shoes. It's not easy. And the fact that I've been doing it for 50 years, I guess shows a degree of I don't know, endurance, I guess. But that's really why I wrote the book, because, I've been doing it for such a long time. And I started writing, and suddenly all these memories around the 1970s, 80s, 90s came flooding back. And it was super interesting and really enjoyable process just of putting all that down on paper.
So tell us about this, because it's all one thing. It's open in June itself, and I was just chatting off air because so I know during the early 90s I was stomping up and down the King's Road, and so it's a big step, if you'll pardon the pun, going from creating stuff that you're going to sell in Kensington Market to actually having your own premises. What made you want to go for it? And the second part of the question is, because you're a chartered accountant, so presumably you knew how to read a ledger, so therefore you weren't just, because people will say, I'm going to go into, follow my passion, and I'm going to do, I don't know, Bolivian latte, whatever, ware, and then they wonder why it doesn't sell, doesn't take off. So what convinced you that you needed to open the store itself? And B, did you have that background in at least knowing facts and figures rather than just saying, oh, people will just flock in, darlings, and buy?
Well, I think, look, I'd been in the industry a long time.
Yeah.
I joined in 1975. I was a manufacturer for 10 years making shoes. So I really understood the product. Then I discovered that, making shoes in London was impossible. So I closed the factory and started importing. And I was importing for the likes of Next, Marks and Spencer's, people like that. And so I really knew the industry well. And what I was finding was that I was doing all the work. I was designing the shoes, I was putting the label in, I was making the shoes. And in the end, it had Next label in. It didn't have June's label. And so I thought to myself, the future must be to create a brand. And that's really what happened in 1992. I was running the import company parallel with the retail company, but I thought, I've really got to try and create my own brand, because at least then I'm going to create some value. The problem is, if I'm doing it for other people, I've got nothing there. So I think that was the defining moment, just suddenly realizing that actually, unless I created my own brand, there wasn't a lot of future where I was going.
So where did you come up with the name? Did you have, and obviously you couldn't call it June now because you're probably sued by the filmmakers or, Frank Herbert's estate or something like that. So how did you come up with a name and not get accused by science fiction fans of, these are not the shoes of Arrakis, etc.? Well,
interesting. At that time, and you're right, it's not easy to find a name, but I really like that metaphor. A sand dune in the wind. It's constantly changing its shape. And a bit like fashion. Fashion also is constantly changing, constantly evolving. And I thought that metaphor was really great. So I thought, this is a great name. I'll choose June. And fortunately, no one else objected. And that's how June was born in 1992.
And how did you find the premises? Because I remember if you talk about, I absolutely remember the name, and I remember also there was Our Souls, which was a little further down the King's Road on the left-hand side, because if you remember that one as well. So how did you find the premises then? How did you and decide, right, this is the place, rather than being, I don't know, in Carnaby Street or in just off Piccadilly, just off one of the tourist traps, as it were.
We had been in concessions in Oxford Street in a clothing store called Jane Norman, and that had been really good, but we couldn't afford Oxford Street. At King's Road, this store we took was a really small store, so it was risk averse. It was sort of in a good position. The rent was reasonable. And I thought, this is a good way to try this concept, rather than invest in a huge, expensive store in the middle of Oxford Street, let's go for something more modest. And as you say, King's Road was a lively place in the 70s, this was the 90s.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite the same as it was, at the beginning, but it was still very fashionable. There, Kensington High Street, those sort of roads were then pretty crucial. So I thought, let's try that. And, I think it was a good decision overall.
What was the eve of the opening, and what was the first day like? You must have had the jitters, the butterflies, surely.
Well, yes, I guess so. The thing is, if you open a store, it doesn't just take off straight away. Very unusual, unless you do something really different. I designed the shoe myself. It was a concept I saw in Paris. It was shoes on top of boxes. And the concept was really because of shoes, they take up a lot of space. And this was a way of selling them quickly. And sort of, I painted the shop. It was a slightly sort of Roman type of feel. To be honest, looking back, I'm not particularly proud of it from an aesthetic point of view, but it worked and gradually built up. And then we opened a second store on Kensington High Street and then another one in a shopping center in Lakeside. So yeah, gradually the momentum grew. And, it was not until we opened in a shopping center that the landlord turned around and said, Daniel, we're not going to accept this on top of boxes. It's just not aspirational enough. You need to do a proper design. And it was at that stage that we changed our concept to something a little bit more, a little bit more aspirational, I guess. Yes.
And whilst sort of a lot of the sort of manufacturing processes that your grandfather would have done with his shoes may have gone through to the 60s and 70s. By the time we hit the 90s, suddenly technology changes. The type of people buying shoes have changed. And how difficult is it to keep it? I mean, you've always been in touch with trends in the shoe industry, but the changes in manufacturing, you mentioned everything's coming in from other parts of the world, but that makes you susceptible to global markets as well. So a crash here can have an impact on your imports and your materials. So it wasn't, it must have been an interesting time to be running the business as well as technology came on and people started to change as well.
Interesting. Technology in footwear hasn't changed a lot.
Right.
From when I first had my factory, the processes are very, very similar. It's just, as I said at the beginning, it's 150 processes. It's not easy to mechanize those. Now, yes, they've made sort of some of the lasting machinery a little bit more sophisticated. Yes, they use laser cutting to cut the leather. But actually, the main process has not changed. And that's the reason why it's moved from UK, from Europe to the Far East, to Taiwan, where I started. Then it was too expensive. Then to China. And now it's gone to Bangladesh and Cambodia. And it's constantly chasing a cheaper source because it is an industry that, 30% of the cost is labor. And, therefore what happens is it's constantly going to cheaper and cheaper countries. So surprisingly, there's been huge technological advances, but not actually in footwear production. If you go to a footwear factory now, it wouldn't be that different from a factory that you would have seen sort of 50 years ago. When
there was sort of global credit crunches and that sort of thing, did people sort of treat shoes as I'm going to splash out and treat myself? The world may be going to hell in a handbasket and I might not be able to feed myself at the end of the week, but my goodness, I'm going to cheer myself up with a damn good pair of boots.
I think there is that. It's what they call it, the lipstick effect. It's buying something that's going to make you during tough times feel better about yourself. And I think there is an element of that. I think people do like shoes. They do love shoes. And the great thing about shoes, you can grow in size, but your feet actually stay very much the same. So I think, yes, there is that love affair with shoes. And, that's great. And, it's just so varied. I mean, you think about it now, obviously everybody's wearing trainers. But you've got such variety of shoes, ballerinas, Dr. Martens, Christian Louboutins, there's a huge variety of shoes for different moods. And it's also a really good way of expressing yourself. When you bought your brogues in the lane,
still got them.
You were expressing yourself. This was something that, that sort of a little bit defined your style. And I think shoes do that. So, I think it is a fascinating product from that perspective, yes.
And another thing is, and people say, well, blokes don't get, listen, gentlemen do get involved with the shoes because I spend a lot of time with people who've been in the thin blue line and also people who are ex-military. And the amount of conversations we have on the Shine and Good Morning Adrian of their shoes, because this guy isn't one of those who'll just swipe he's got the full kit with the wax and the spoon and we have these in-depth conversations about the mechanics of shoe polishing. I know that sounds an Iraq fact, but it's a true thing.
It is. And, people do spit and polish their shoes, to get that real shine on the toe cap, and, there's no substitute for doing that, having real polish. I don't think many people do it these days.
Well, yeah.
But, if you want a really super wet pair of shoes with a nice toe cap, that shines or the quarters that shine, that's the way to do it. You know, the old fashioned way of doing it, certainly.
Now, you wrote the book, Soul Survivor, but it's not just for people who are into shoes. The lessons that you've learned in 50 years of being in this business can be applied obviously to any other business, and the attributes that you need surely are the same across the board.
I think you're right. I think, I made a lot of mistakes, but over the period of 50 years, I've learned a lot about, what are the good things to do? What are the bad things to do? How to set up a business. I mean, the importance of people and building the right team. Building relationships is absolutely crucial. I mean, one of the most enjoyable things about doing the work has been traveling. We have 35% of our business is international. So I travel to see our partners around the world, but I also go to lots and lots of factories because I have a very close relationship with them. So I think, it's a great lesson in terms of building relationships, in the importance of really selling and getting out there and seeing people. So, I think there are some really good lessons there in how to build a business, how to be resilient. Over the last sort of 10 years, can you think of a more difficult time to have had a business like ours? The pandemic, all of our stores were closed. Brexit, all of our European business was difficult. The wars recently, adding 3 weeks to lead time. So it has been a challenge, but I think writing the book, I think it does tell a story about resilience and about how you can overcome some of these problems if you really do focus on the positives, yes.
And when you sat down to write the book, how did you find that? Were you flicking through notes and order books and journals that you might have kept or clippings? How do you go back and does that spark other memories? You're like, oh blimey, I remember those.
It's funny actually, because my son who read the book said, how the hell did you remember all that? Did you keep a journal? I didn't keep a journal, but it's amazing how once I started writing, a whole load of memories just came flooding back. I guess as you get older, you can't remember what happened yesterday, but you can remember what happened in 1975. So, it was a really cathartic experience because I did remember all those visits that I made to India in the 80s and China and Taiwan and Vietnam. Getting arrested in Hong Kong, all these things came flooded back. And actually, I suppose in some respect, I'm also a little bit of a frustrated author. I really like the writing process. So that helped. The combination of, 50 years, quite enjoying writing and those flood of memories, made it a really enjoyable experience.
Would you say that, running a successful business is a mixture of having the creativity to think, as the Americans say, out of the box, i.e., because you've got to be nimble, if you like. You've got to be ready for challenge. But at the same time, having the discipline, which you probably obviously had from those years of chartered accountancy and knowing how to run a business. Because I said, we're all full of, I've got, teenage goddaughters and their social media feeds are full of people following their dream and, working their life, and all that sort of stuff. I'll use that word. That's great, fantastic, but you have to be able to put in the grind, right? And put in the hard yards. You don't just click a finger and say, "I'm going to start a shoe shop and online." And why isn't my Etsy store now making me a millionaire by Friday?
I think you're quite right. I think there is some really worrying statistics about the number of businesses that fail after the first year. I think something like 90%. So I think you've got to be entrepreneurial. You've got to have a good idea. And you need to test that idea. You hear these stories about people putting a lot of money, a lot of time into a new business, and you step back and you think, this isn't going to work. They haven't done the research. They haven't been out there to test whether or not it's really right. So I think that's the first thing. You need to have a niche in the market. You need to have something which is, the market is so competitive, so crowded that you need something that's a little bit different. And I think then, you're absolutely right. You need to have those disciplines. The number of businesses that run out of money, they just haven't done that sort of rigorous business plan. So you need to have that. And the last element, I think, that is also slightly missing in this digital age is that ability just to get out there and meet people and test your idea and talk to potential customers and get advice. Because, when I started selling shoes, it was difficult, but persistence really paid off. And people eventually sort of took pity on me and said, okay, yeah, Daniel, I'll buy a few pairs of shoes. So I think you've got to have all those elements. But above all, I think you've got to be a risk taker to some extent. You've got to be prepared to put a certain amount of your wealth on the line. And that doesn't suit everybody because it's hard work and it can be stressful. But if you're successful or slightly successful, it's hugely rewarding to be able to build that business and look back, as I've been able to do, and say, yeah, I created something. I've created employment for people. I've really built something. And that is just really, really sort of fulfilling, I think.
The book is called Soul Survivor, How I Built a Global Shoe Brand. It's by Daniel Rubin, who's speaking today. Daniel, if people want to find you online, do you dip your toe, your well-heeled toe, in the murky waters of social media? Is there a website? Where can people find you?
Well, obviously through my company, junelondon.com. I have started off on LinkedIn. My daughter's super good on social. I am not. I'm a novice. I'm starting. I'm getting some help with LinkedIn. So LinkedIn, I do have some presence. I'm not that good at the moment on Instagram. It's something I need to, get more engaged with. But yeah, there you go.
The listeners, you can order the book via our own virtual bookstore. Just click on the rather splendid pair of shoes, and it'll be winging its way to you. The book is called Soul Survivor. It's by Daniel Rubin. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure. Thanks.